Well, good morning, everybody. I think all of you have been here before to Credo, but we're glad to have you here, and thank you for joining us on this earlier time today. I'm happy to introduce Doris Browder to you. I think many of you know her. You may not know that she started coming to what was then our church, now our community, in 1970. So she has a lot of institutional memory that she could share with us if you wanted to ask her some questions. Over the years, she's volunteered as a teacher in RE. She's helped with addict sales. She helped with our partner church in Romania. And I believe she's a member of the Jabberwocks, right, Doris?
Yeah, that's right.
Several of you may know that Doris is a poet, and you'll get a taste of that, more than a taste of that, in her presentation today, as she'll speak for possibly 20 minutes. And during that time, as you know, you can write any questions you have on chat, but be sure to keep them in the form of a question and keep them concise if possible. After she concludes, I'll read the questions to her and she'll answer. So I'll turn things over to you, Doris. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. This was an opportunity for me. I've divided, in an effort to organize my material, I've divided it into two parts. And the first is the childhood foundation. And then the second part is my church religion experiences. I was born 7 miles outside of Andrews, South Carolina. I was the oldest of 3 children. I was born in 1935, my sister Harriet in 1936, my brother Lawrence in 1939. My sister and I were born at home, actually at my grandparents' house, where my parents lived, and a few other people that came and went during that time. But my brother was born at our own house about a mile away. The first child had died at childbirth.
I had no idea they would be that playful. Like they would roll.
Which was a sorrow that they never recovered from. No one had electricity. No one had electricity until 1941. We had watched the men come by and put the poles up and string the wires. But one day my mother took us out on the porch holding my brother in her arms, and we watched a man climb the pole and take a wire and move it from the transformer to the wire, and the porch light came on. It was like magic, even in broad daylight. We children were obedient. There was no unpleasantness associated with being obedient, no physical punishment. Instructions were sparing and enforcement was consistent. Being obedient gave us a calm, secure milieu in which to grow up. My father was a kind man. He resisted the toxic masculinity of his era, and he avoided the harshness that he had seen himself growing up. He was steadfast, devoted to his family. He worked many years at a very unpleasant job to support his family. He belonged to his community.
Unpleasant job.
Was it?
He worked an unpleasant job.
What was the job?
Oh.
Who am I hearing instead of me? Somebody. He belonged to his community, and he was a participant in the community to a point, supporting community endeavors. Of course, the church and the community were essentially the same thing. So he cared about the needy and respected their dignity. But when he was asked, he drew the line at joining the White Citizens Council, which was begun right after Brown versus the Board of Education. My mother was a lifelong learner and maintained her curiosity about almost everything. Her schooling had been very erratic because they moved so many times, but she finished high school in Summerville, South Carolina in 1919. She had been a teacher at several 1- and 2-room schools all over South Carolina primarily. But as a teacher boarding with families, she had learned quite a bit about how to get along with people, and for that reason, she never gossiped, not once, never, as far as I can remember. She tried to live up to community expectations. One time, somebody came and was fishing on Sunday at our pond, and she left a note on the windshield, "Not on Sunday, please." And then she told us, "I have to live in this community." Both parents sheltered us from the bad stuff that was going on in our community. A lot easier to do back then, when even the people doing the bad stuff wanted to keep it hidden. Both parents, when they gave, and they did give, tried to give anonymously. About a mile from our house was the church. It had been started by my great-grandfather and some of his children, plus a few others. At first, they met in a grape arbor, or just an arbor, as they called it. But in 1919, they began construction on a wooden house. My grandfather was one of the carpenters, and every man in the community did something. They would not have thought of staying home and leaving the whole thing to one person. When I was a child, we had 2 Sundays a month, preaching, as we called it. And the preacher drove from Florence, which is about 60 miles, I guess, twice a month for our church. Most of those years, we also had Sunday school every Sunday. My mother had a huge role in keeping that Sunday school going, and she said that she liked having something to do like that because it gave her something to think about during the rest of the week. We young folks had a Sunday school booklet with the lesson in it, and occasionally there would be a little activity like cut out a picture and paste it on a certain place. And many a time we used egg white as glue because we didn't have any paste. Some of the time we had a little glass bottle of what we call mucilage. It has a little rubber cap on it with a slit in it. So during the summertime, mostly in the late 40s and early 50s, we had Vacation Bible School. So all along in Sunday school and in Bible school, we heard all the Bible stories over and over again. And in Sunday school, we sang, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. Red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight." And even then, I felt kind of uneasy about that song because it didn't seem to me to go along with what I actually saw all around me. In the fall, not every year, but most years, we had revival meetings. One visiting preacher deliberately worked himself up into a frenzy as he declaimed, to the point that he was actually foaming at the mouth. And I, as a preteen or young teen, was very scornful of him at that time. We had another preacher, actually one of my father's many cousins. He led more than one revival, and he became a sort of cult figure to some of the people in the church. I think it's because he was from faraway city of Columbia, South Carolina. In any case, during one of his visits, I answered the altar call, probably during the hymn "Just As I Am," which they played over and over again. I believe now that my coming forward had less to do with salvation and more to do with wanting to fit in. And right after that, I was baptized by immersion in Black River. And yes, the water is black. You hold it up, it looks like a glass of iced tea. And this was a site on the river where my parents had been baptized, and it was a boat landing and a rec center and a sometimes ceremonial place. In the meantime, my grandfather had moved away. He was in his late 60s, I would guess, about that time. And whenever he returned to visit us, he came to church, of course, and he was inevitably called on to pray because he was one of the senior founders of the church. He knelt down beside the homemade wooden bench and quietly talked to God. Nobody could hear him. His voice barely audible, tears running down his face. I was sitting right next to him. At Easter, one preacher got into it and launched into a much too vivid description of Christ on the cross, very gruesome. Later on at home, my brother, who was about 6, said, I don't know why they didn't just put him in jail for a while. It's true, we heard an awful lot about Jesus's sacrifice on the cross and precious little about his revolutionary message. Usually, though, the little church was pleasant enough, calm, and for a child, and we didn't resist going. Our weekday lives were so uneventful, school and home, and Sundays were actually a welcome. We were even permitted to play ball in the front yard on Sunday afternoons. At any time, we could play Old Maid or Authors, but we couldn't play and didn't have a deck of cards that had all those sinful things associated with gambling. A small incident probably foreshadows my movement away from the church of my youth. Our Sunday school class thought we might like to order from the Southern Baptist Convention a little lapel pin to wear, all of us having the same pin. There were several choices, but I lobbied hard for the one that said others because I found it less offensive than some of the other, and I don't remember what those were. When I went off to college in 1952 to North Greenville Junior College, I tried to fit in, but soon, while I relished the music and the singing, I was turned off by the pious expressions of my classmates. For example, one young man related one morning that he had seen a vision in his room, a cloud with the initials P and C. He interpreted those initials to mean that he was to preach Christ. I privately thought he had seen steam from the radiator, but his fellow classmates teased him and said it really meant plow corn. At North Greenville, it was normal but not required for a class to begin with a short prayer. On Sundays, almost everyone, except those who could go home for the weekend, walked down the hill to church, and again at night, and again on Wednesday nights. And there was the obligatory chapel attendance every day, I think. Because we were more or less expected to go to Furman to finish our degrees, I decided to go across the mountains to Carson Newman in Tennessee. I gave no thought to how inconvenient travel would be, just as I gave no thought to the considerable sacrifice my parents were making so that I could attend college. I could have saved them a bundle of money if I had gone to Winthrop, which was state supported, but I did not consider that either. To get to Carson Newman for my junior and senior years, I first had to get to Columbia to catch the train. And that meant having someone take me to town 7 miles away so that I could catch the bus and get to Columbia to catch the train. The trip by train from Columbia across the mountains was a slow journey, and the train paused in Jefferson City, Tennessee, just long enough for a handful of us to get off in the dark with our small suitcases, arrange for our trunks to be sent up the next day, and walk up the hill to find our dormitories, because obviously I had never seen the place, never visited. At Carson Newman, I first attended the main Baptist church. I watched some of my professors sitting in their pews, and I wondered to myself, you're a teacher. How can you sit there and listen to this? I soon decided to visit a small Presbyterian church. The minister was young, the service was less rote. It felt like a daring move to attend there. After graduation, I moved to Chattanooga and got a job. At first, I again attended First Baptist, but soon became impatient with it because, for one thing, the preacher had an honorary doctorate from a school that didn't even grant doctorates, and he loved being called Dr. So-and-so. The services were very routine, very ordinary. I had married a college classmate from Chattanooga at the much too young age of 21, but we gave up on First Baptist and began attending a small mission church. We were active participants, but a few years later, my 26-year-old husband died of leukemia. I found no comfort in religion. I went through the funeral and whatever had to be done with the help of his parents, who wanted things done the way they understood they should be done. At one point, we had to go to a new cemetery to choose a plot, and I chose the area called the Beatitudes because it sounded less pious than the ones beside it. I mean, who could object to the Beatitudes? That seems safe enough. After a year, I left Chattanooga to attend UNC Chapel Hill. In 1962, I met Bill Blau. He had come out of the tradition of the Church of the Brethren. Both of his grandparents were ministers in that faith. However, living in Rochester, New York, he had come across the Unitarians, partly by singing in their choir and the Rochester Oratorio Society. And one day he handed me a pamphlet about the UU faith. I was surprised and relieved. You mean there's a whole denomination that thinks the way I do? I heard a minister in Houston once who had come through the Baptist faith and had been to Baptist seminary, where he said Unitarians were lumped under cults and sects. And he said, here was doubt institutionalized. I had been teaching in Wilson, North Carolina, where I attended the Disciples of Christ Church. Bill Blau and I married in their chapel and moved to Houston in 1964. For 6 years, we attended and were members of First Unitarian Church on Fannin Street. Before we left Houston for Rock Hill, we investigated and found that there was a UU church near enough to Rock Hill. We arrived in the fall of 1970, and I've been here ever since. I'm still learning and still growing. I'm going to read one poem which actually summarizes everything I just got through saying. Maybe I should have just read that instead. This is called Coming to Terms with Religion. Pasted a picture for Sunday school. Heard Noah's Ark, Jonah and the Whale, Wise Men at Bethlehem. Attended nighttime revivals at Country Church. Saw sinners come forward to be saved. Felt wordless urge to belong and received river baptism. Read Shakespeare, To thine own self be true. Milton, a mind can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Emerson, whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. Whitman, I could turn and live with animals. They do not make me sick discussing their duty to God. At small Christian church, for small Christians, the joke went. Pious teachers, stale sermons delivered with smug assurance, dismissing doubt. Anxious students longing for the call to preach Jesus Christ, not his love, but him crucified. One sophomore saw a vision in his dorm room. PC, the cloud read. Preach Christ, he interpreted. Plow corn, his fellows teased. Discovered the universe and Dr. Einstein. Learned how humans' limited senses cannot know completely even the concrete world. How much less then our ability to know the abstract, I reasoned. Religion is felt, not known. I accept not knowing. Turn to this present, do the best I can with what I am given, and do no harm. The end, as they say in the movies.
Thank you so much, Doris. And thank you for ending it with one of your poems. Makes me want to hear more of them. I'm going to invite people now to write questions on chat, and we'll have a chance to ask about them. Let's see just a second what we have there. Let's see. Okay, what's the most important change you've seen in UUCC in all your years here?
Oh my gosh. I think a very open embrace, not among the congregation and not just the minister, excuse me, a very open embrace of who we are and not an apologetic attitude toward it.
Okay. Someone else says, what did you study in college and what did you teach?
I majored in English and psychology in undergraduate school and then got a master's in English from Chapel Hill. I taught up and down, sometimes 12th grade, sometimes 9th. I started out in 5th grade, which I was totally unprepared to do, but I did it. The last 14 years were 7th grade language arts in York, South Carolina, where we had a curriculum that was very bad. And I tried to teach writing as much as I could.
When did you start writing poetry?
Well, if we don't count what I wrote in the 8th grade, which was the rhymes like moon and June, if you don't count those, I would say off and on, but seriously, thanks to Catherine McIntyre and Jabberwocks, about 96, maybe, something like that.
What was your first what was your interracial experience?
Growing up, we had one family that lived down the street from us who, well, it's not a street, it's a road, for heaven's sake. But anyway, but we didn't have a lot of interaction with anybody. And they were the only Black family in that community. Most of the girls in that family were older. And one time when they wanted to try to plait my hair in braids, and boy, were they disappointed because it sprang out from everything they were trying to do. They soon moved, part of that migration, and they went to, actually went to Rochester, New York. The first class I taught that was integrated was at York Tech, and that was 1976, I think.
Okay. Jabberwocks are published poets. will you share some of your experience with that? I think they mean with publishing or with Jabberwocks.
The thing I liked about Jabberwocks was that most of us who were in there were serious about improving. We weren't there just to read something and have everybody say, "Oh, that's great." Some of the people in there didn't like it if your poems weren't happy poems, but most of them weren't. At the beginning, I don't have the date in front of me, Joe Spencer managed to get some of the poems from the early Jabberwocks put into little booklets. There were 3 of them. I don't have all of them, and I don't think the library does either. When my first little chapbook was a contest put on by Finishing Line Press, and they were looking for different people who didn't sound the same. So out of the chapbooks that were submitted, I think they chose 40 to publish, and that's how mine got in that batch. The second little book, bigger book, I thought to myself, I am too old and too tired to try to market it to a publisher, and I certainly don't want to go around trying to promote the book and sell the copies, which the publisher would like you to do. So it's self-published. Thank goodness for the help of a young friend of mine who's tech savvy and an artist and a poet. So I hired her to deal with the nitty-gritty of making sure that everything was right down to the micro inch, because it was a real pain. And a friend who lives in pretty close to me is an artist, and she drew the pictures that are in there. So I paid for it.
Is that in the church library?
I don't, oh, I must have given it to you. I don't remember now.
Oh, I bet a number of us would love to see it and read some of it.
If you do, it's this one.
And it's called what?
Scent of Tangerine.
Scent of Tangerine. Okay. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
Well, thank you so much for sharing with us today. This was fascinating, and
Thank you.
and really, I want to read some of your poetry, and I want to have a conversation with you. You and I have a lot of things in common. Other people may feel the same way.
Good. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
So thank you so much for joining us, and we're very grateful to have heard from you.
Thank you. Thank you.